With a deep breath of relief and straightening myself to my full height, I then entered the drawing room. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The Sudden Walk.
When it looks as if you had made up your mind finally to stay at home for the evening, when you have put on your house jacket and sat down after supper with a light on the table to the piece of work or the game that usually precedes your going to bed, when the weather outside is unpleasant so that staying indoors seems natural, and when you have already been sitting quietly at the table for so long that your departure must occasion surprise to everyone, when, besides, the stairs are in darkness and the front door locked, and in spite of all that you have started up in a sudden fit of restlessness, changed your jacket, abruptly dressed yourself for the street, explained that you must go out and with a few curt words of leave-taking actually gone out, banging the flat door more or less hastily according to the degree of displeasure you think you have left behind you, and when you find yourself once more in the street with limbs swinging extra freely in answer to the unexpected liberty you have procured for them, when as a result of this decisive action you feel concentrated within yourself all the potentialities of decisive action, when you recognize with more than usual significance that your strength is greater than your need to accomplish effortlessly the swiftest of changes and to cope with it, when in this frame of mind you go striding down the long streets, then for that evening you have completely got away from your family, which fades into insubstantiality, while you yourself, a firm, boldly drawn black figure, slapping yourself on the thigh, grow to your When it looks as if you had made up your mind finally to stay at home for the evening, when you have put on your house jacket and sat down after supper with a light on the table to the piece of work or the game that usually precedes your going to bed, when the weather outside is unpleasant so that staying indoors seems natural, and when you have already been sitting quietly at the table for so long that your departure must occasion surprise to everyone, when, besides, the stairs are in darkness and the front door locked, and in spite of all that you have started up in a sudden fit of restlessness, changed your jacket, abruptly dressed yourself for the street, explained that you must go out and with a few curt words of leave-taking actually gone out, banging the flat door more or less hastily according to the degree of displeasure you think you have left behind you, and when you find yourself once more in the street with limbs swinging extra freely in answer to the unexpected liberty you have procured for them, when as a result of this decisive action you feel concentrated within yourself all the potentialities of decisive action, when you recognize with more than usual significance that your strength is greater than your need to accomplish effortlessly the swiftest of
The sudden walk. Hastily according to the degree of displeasure you think you have left behind you, and when you find yourself once more in the street with limbs swinging extra freely in answer to the unexpected liberty you have procured for them, when as a result of this decisive action you feel concentrated within yourself all the potentialities of decisive action, when you recognize with more than usual significance that your strength is greater than your need to accomplish effortlessly the swiftest of changes and to cope with it, when in this frame of mind you go striding down the long streets, then for that evening you have completely got away from your family, which fades into insubstantiality, while you yourself, a firm, boldly drawn black figure, slapping yourself on the thigh, grow to your true stature. All this is still heightened if at such a late hour in the evening you look up a friend to see how he is getting on. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Resolutions. To lift yourself out of a miserable mood, even if you have to do it by strength of will, should be easy. I force myself out of my chair, stride around the table, exercise my head and neck, make my eyes sparkle, tighten the muscles around them. Defy my own feelings, welcome A enthusiastically supposing he comes to see me, amiably tolerate B in my room, swallow all that is said at C's, whatever pain and trouble it may cost me, in long drafts. Yet even if I manage that, one single slip, and a slip cannot be avoided, will stop the whole process, easy and painful alike, and I will have to shrink back into my own circle again. So perhaps the best resource is to meet everything passively, to make yourself an inert mass, and, if you feel that you are being carried away, not to let yourself be lured into taking a single unnecessary step, to stare at others with the eyes of an animal, to feel no compunction, in short, with your own hand to throttle down whatever ghostly life remains in you, that is, to enlarge the final piece of the graveyard and let nothing survive save that. A characteristic movement in such a condition is to run your little finger along your eyebrows. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. A dream. Joseph K. was dreaming. It was a beautiful day and K. felt like going for a walk. But hardly had he taken a couple of steps when he was already at the cemetery. The paths there were very winding, ingeniously made, and unpractical, but he glided along one of them as if on a rushing stream with unshaken poise and balance. From a long way off his eye was caught by a freshly heaped grave mound which he wanted to pause beside. This grave mound exerted almost a fascination over him and he felt he could not reach it fast enough. But he often nearly lost sight of it, for his view was obscured by banners which veered and flapped against each other with great force. One could not see the standard bearers, but there seemed to be a very joyous celebration going on. While he was still peering into the distance, he suddenly saw the grave mound quite near his path, indeed he was almost leaving it behind him. He made a hasty spring onto the grass. But since the path went rushing on under his shifting foot, he tottered and fell on his knees just in front of the grave mound. Two men were standing behind the grave and were holding a gravestone between them in the air. Scarcely had K arrived when they thrust the stone into the earth and it stood as if cemented there. Out of some bushes there came at once a third man, whom K recognized immediately as an artist. He was clad only in trousers and a badly buttoned shirt, on his head was a velvet cap, in his hand he held an ordinary pencil with which he was already drawing figures in the air as he approached. With this pencil he now addressed himself to the top end of the gravestone. The stone was very tall, he did not have to bend down, though he had to bend forward, since the grave mound, on which he shrank from setting foot, came between him and the stone. So he stood on tiptoe and steadied himself with his left hand on the stone's flat surface. With an astonishing turn of skill he managed to produce golden letters from his ordinary pencil. He wrote, "Here lies." Every letter was clear and beautifully made, deeply incised and of the purest gold. When he had inscribed these two words he looked at K over his shoulder. K, who was very eager to know how the inscription would go, paid hardly any attention to the man but was intent only on the stone. And in fact the man turned again to continue writing, but he could not go on, something was hindering him. He let the pencil sink and once more turned toward K. This time K looked back at him and noted that he was deeply embarrassed and yet unable to explain himself. All his earlier vivacity had vanished. That made K feel embarrassed too. They exchanged helpless glances. There was some dreadful misunderstanding between them which neither could resolve. An untimely little bell now began to ring from the cemetery chapel, but the artist made a sign with uplifted hand and the bell stopped. In a little while it began again. This time quite softly and without any insistence, breaking off again at once, as if it were only testing its own tone. Kay felt miserable because of the artist's predicament. He began to cry and sobbed for a long time into his cupped hands. The artist waited until Kay had calmed down and then decided, since there was no help for it, just to go on with the inscription. The first small stroke that he made was a relief to Kay, but the artist obviously achieved it only with the greatest reluctance. The work, too, was no longer beautifully finished. Above all, there seemed to be a lack of gold leaf. Pale and uncertain, the stroke straggled down, only it turned into a very big letter. It was AJ. It was almost finished, and at that moment the artist stamped angrily on the grave mound with one foot so that the soil all around flew up in the air. At long last Kay understood him. It was too late to start apologizing now. With all his fingers he dug into the earth, which offered almost no resistance. Everything seemed prepared beforehand. A thin crust of earth had been constructed only for the look of the thing. Immediately beneath it a great hole opened out, with steep sides, into which Kay sank, wafted onto his back by a gentle current. And while he was already being received into impenetrable depths, his head still straining upwards on his neck, his own name raced across the stone above him in great flourishes. Enchanted by the sight, he woke up. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Up in the gallery. If some frail, consumptive equestrian in the circus were to be urged around and around on an undulating horse for months on end without respite by a ruthless, whip-flourishing ringmaster, before an insatiable public, whizzing along on her horse, throwing kisses, swaying from the waist, and if this performance were likely to continue in the infinite perspective of a drab future to the unceasing roar of the orchestra and hum of the ventilators, accompanied by ebbing and renewed swelling bursts of applause which are really steam hammers, then, perhaps, a young visitor to the gallery might race down the long stairs through all the circles, rush into the ring, and yell, "Stop!" against the fanfares of the orchestra still playing the appropriate music.
But since that is not so, a lovely lady, pink and white, floats in between the curtains, which proud lackeys open before her. The ringmaster, deferentially catching her eye, comes toward her breathing animal devotion, tenderly lifts her up on the dapple gray, as if she were his own most precious granddaughter about to start on a dangerous journey, cannot make up his mind to give the signal with his whip, finally masters himself enough to crack the whip loudly, runs along beside the horse, open-mouthed, follows with a sharp eye the leaps taken by its rider, finds her artistic skill almost beyond belief, calls to her with English shouts of warning, angrily exhorts the grooms who hold the hoops to be most closely attentive, before the great somersault lifts up his arms and implores the orchestra to be silent, finally lifts the little one down from her trembling horse, kisses her on both cheeks, and finds that all the ovation she gets from the audience is barely sufficient, while she herself, supported by him. But since that is not so, a lovely lady, pink and white, floats in between the curtains, which proud lackeys open before her. The ringmaster, deferentially catching her eye, comes toward her breathing animal devotion, tenderly lifts her up on the dapple gray, as if she were his own most precious granddaughter about to start on a dangerous journey, cannot make up his mind to give the signal with his whip, finally masters himself enough to crack the whip loudly, runs along beside the horse, open-mouthed, follows with a sharp eye the leaps taken by its rider, finds her artistic skill almost beyond belief, calls to her with English shouts of warning, angrily exhorts the grooms who hold the hoops to be most closely attentive, before the great somersault lifts up his arms and implores the orchestra to be silent, finally lifts the little one down from her trembling horse, kisses her on both cheeks, and finds that all the ovation she gets from the audience is barely sufficient, while she herself, supported by him, right up on the tips of her toes, in a cloud of dust, with outstretched arms and small head thrown back, invites the whole circus to share her triumph. Since that is so, the visitor to the gallery lays his face on the rail before him and, sinking into the closing march as into a heavy dream, weeps without knowing it. Durley lifts her up on the dapple gray, as if she were his own most precious granddaughter about to start on a dangerous journey, cannot make up his mind to give the signal with his whip, finally masters himself enough to crack the whip loudly, runs along beside the horse, open-mouthed, follows with a sharp eye the leaps taken by its rider, finds her artistic skill almost beyond belief, calls to her with English shouts of warning, angrily exhorts the grooms who hold the hoops to be most closely attentive, before the great somersault lifts up his arms and implores the orchestra to be silent, finally lifts the little one down from her trembling horse, kisses her on both cheeks, and finds that all the ovation she gets from the audience is barely sufficient, while she herself, supported by him, right up on the tips of her toes, in a cloud of dust, with outstretched arms and small head thrown back, invites the whole circus to share her triumph. Since that is so, the visitor to the gallery lays his face on the rail before him and, sinking into the closing march as into a heavy dream, weeps without knowing it.
Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. A fratricide. The evidence shows that this is how the murder was committed. Schmar, the murderer, took up his post about 9 o'clock one night in clear moonlight by the corner where Wheeze, his victim, had to turn from the street where his office was into the street he lived in. The night air was shivering cold. Yet Schmar was wearing only a thin blue suit. The jacket was unbuttoned, too. He felt no cold. Besides, he was moving about all the time. His weapon, half a bayonet and half a kitchen knife, he kept firmly in his grasp, quite naked. He looked at the knife against the light of the moon. The blade glittered. Not enough for Schmar. He struck it against the bricks of the pavement till the sparks flew. Regretted that, perhaps, and to repair the damage drew it like a violin bow across his boot sole while he bent forward, standing on one leg, and listened both to the whetting of the knife on his boot and for any sound out of the fateful side street. Why did Pallas, the private citizen who was watching it all from his window nearby in the second story, permit it to happen? Unriddle the mysteries of human nature. With his collar turned up, his dressing gown girt around his portly body, he stood looking down, shaking his head. And 5 houses further along, on the opposite side of the street, Mrs. Wheeze, with a fox fur coat over her nightgown, peered out to look for her husband who was lingering unusually late tonight. At last there rang out the sound of the doorbell before Wheeze's office, too loud for a doorbell, right over the town and up to heaven, and Wheeze, the industrious nightworker, issued from the building, still invisible in that street, only heralded by the sound of the bell. At once the pavement registered his quiet footsteps. Pallas bent far forward, he dared not miss anything. Mrs. Wheeze, reassured by the bell, shut her window with a clatter. But Schmar knelt down, since he had no other parts of his body bare, he pressed only his face and his hands against the pavement. Where everything else was freezing, Schmar was glowing hot. At the very corner dividing the 2 streets Wheeze paused, only his walking stick came around into the other street to support him. A sudden whim. The night sky invited him, with its dark blue and its gold. Unknowing, he gazed up at it. Unknowing, he lifted his hat and stroked his hair. Nothing up there drew together in a pattern to interpret the immediate future for him. Everything stayed in its senseless, inscrutable place. In itself, it was a highly reasonable action that Wheeze should walk on, but he walked onto Schmar's knife. Wheeze! Shrieked Schmar, standing on tiptoe, his arm outstretched, the knife sharply lowered. Wheeze! You will never see Julia again. And right into the throat and left into the throat and a third time deep into the belly stabbed Schmar's knife. Water rats, slit open, give out such a sound as came from Wheeze. Done, said Schmar, and pitched the knife, now superfluous blood-stained ballast, against the nearest house front. The bliss of murder, the relief, the soaring ecstasy from the shedding of another's blood. Wheeze, old nightbird, friend, alehouse crony, you are oozing away into the dark earth below the street. Why aren't you simply a bladder of blood so that I could stamp on you and make you vanish into nothingness? Not all we want comes true, not all the dreams that blossomed have borne fruit, your solid remains lie here, already indifferent to every kick. What's the good of the dumb question you are asking? Pallas, choking on the poison in his body, stood at the double-leafed door of his house as it flew open. Schmar, Schmar, I saw it all, I missed nothing. Pallas and Schmar scrutinized each other. The result of the scrutiny satisfied Pallas. Schmar came to no conclusion. Mrs. Wheeze, with a crowd of people on either side, came rushing up, her face grown quite old with the shock. Her fur coat swung open, she collapsed on top of Wheeze, the nightgown body belonged to Wheeze, the fur coat spreading over the couple like the smooth turf of a grave belonged to the crowd. Schmar, fighting down with difficulty the last of his nausea, pressed his mouth against the shoulder of the policeman who, stepping lightly, led him away. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The next village. My grandfather used to say, life is astoundingly short. To me, looking back over it, life seems so foreshortened that I scarcely understand, for instance, how a young man can decide to ride over to the next village without being afraid that, not to mention accidents, even the span of a normal happy life may fall far short of the time needed for such a journey. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. A visit to a mine. Today the chief engineers have been down to our part of the mine. The management has issued some instructions or other about boring new galleries, and so the engineers arrived to make the initial survey. How young these men are and yet how different from each other. They have all grown up in freedom and show clearly defined characters without self-consciousness even in their youth. 1. A lively man with black hair, has eyes that take in everything. A second with a notebook makes jottings as he goes, looks around him, compares, notes down. A third, his hands in his coat pockets, so that everything about him is taut, walks very upright, maintains his dignity. Only the fact that he keeps biting his lips betrays his impatient, irrepressible youth. A fourth showers explanations on the third, who does not ask for them, smaller than the other, trotting beside him like a temper, his index finger always in the air, he seems to be making a running commentary on everything he sees. A fifth, perhaps the senior in rank, suffers no one to accompany him, now he is in front, now behind. The group accommodates its pace to him. He is pallid and frail. Responsibility has made his eyes hollow. He often presses his hand to his forehead in thought. The sixth and seventh walk leaning forward a little, their heads close together, arm in arm, in confidential talk. If this were not unmistakably our coal mine and our working station in the deepest gallery, one could easily believe that these bony, Cleanshaven, knobbly-nosed gentlemen were young clerics. One of them laughs mostly to himself with a cat-like purring, the other, smiling too, leads the conversation and beats some kind of time to it with his free hand. How sure these two must be of their position. Yes, what services must they have already rendered to our mine in spite of their youth, to be able here, on such an important survey, under the eyes of their chief, to devote themselves so unwaveringly to their own affairs, or at least to affairs that have nothing to do with the immediate task? Or might it be possible that, in spite of their laughter and apparent inattention, they are very well aware of whatever is needful? One scarcely ventures to pass a decisive judgment on gentlemen like these. On the other hand, there is no doubt at all that the eighth man, for instance, is incomparably more intent on his work than these two, indeed more than all the other gentlemen. He has to touch everything and tap it with a little hammer which he keeps taking out of his pocket and putting back again. He often goes down on his knees in the dirt, despite his elegant attire, and taps the ground, then again taps the walls as he walks along or the roof over his head. Once he stretched himself out at full length and lay still. We were beginning to think something had gone wrong with him. Then with a sudden recoil of his lithe body he sprang to his feet. He had only been making another investigation. We fancy that we know our mine and its rock formations, but what this engineer can be sounding all the time in such a manner lies beyond our comprehension. A ninth man pushes a kind of perambulator in front of him with the surveying instruments. Extremely expensive apparatus, deeply embedded in the softest cotton wool. The office porter ought really to be pushing this vehicle, but he is not trusted with it. An engineer has to do it, and one can see that he does it with good will. He is probably the youngest, perhaps he doesn't even understand all the apparatus yet, but he keeps his eye on the instruments all the time, which brings him often into danger of running his vehicle into the wall. But there is another engineer walking alongside who prevents that from happening. Obviously he understands the apparatus thoroughly and seems to be really the man in charge of it. From time to time, without stopping the vehicle, he takes up a part of some instrument, peers through it, screws it open or shut, shakes it and taps it, holds it to his ear and listens. And finally, while the man pushing the instruments usually stands still, he lays the small thing, which one can scarcely discern at a distance, back into its packing with great care. This engineer is a little domineering, but only in the service of his instruments. 10 paces ahead of the perambulator we have to give way to it at a wordless sign of his finger, even where there is no room for us to make way. Behind these two gentlemen stalks the office porter, with nothing to do. The gentlemen, as is to be expected from men of their great knowledge, have long dropped any arrogance they ever had, but the porter seems to have picked it all up and kept it. With one hand tucked behind him, the other in front fingering the gilt buttons or fine facecloth of his uniform, he keeps bowing to right and left as if we had saluted him and he were answering, or rather as if he assumed that we had saluted him, he being too high and mighty to see any salutes. Of course we do not salute him, yet one could almost believe, to look at him, that it is a great distinction to be a porter at the head office of the mine. Behind his back, to be sure, we burst out laughing, but as not even a thunderbolt could make him look around, he remains an unsolved riddle for us to respect. Today we shall not do much work. The interruption has been too interesting. Such a visit draws away with it all thoughts of work. It is too tempting to stand gazing after the gentlemen as they vanish into the darkness of the trial gallery. Besides, our shift will soon come to an end. We shall not be here to see them coming back. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. Jackals and Arabs. We were camping in the oasis. My companions were asleep. The tall, white figure of an Arab passed by. He had been seeing to the camels and was on his way to his own sleeping place. I threw myself on my back in the grass. I tried to fall asleep. I could not. A jackal howled in the distance. I sat up again. And what had been so far away was all at once quite near. Jackals were swarming around me, eyes gleaming dull gold and vanishing again, lithe bodies moving nimbly and rhythmically, as if at the crack of a whip. One jackal came from behind me, nudging right under my arm, pressing against me, as if he needed my warmth, and then stood before me and spoke to me almost eye to eye. I am the oldest jackal far and wide. I am delighted to have met you here at last. I had almost given up hope, since we have been waiting endless years for you. My mother waited for you, and her mother, and all our foremothers right back to the first mother of all the jackals. It is true, believe me. That is surprising, said I, forgetting to kindle the pile of firewood which lay ready to smoke away jackals. That is very surprising for me to hear. It is by pure chance that I have come here from the far north, and I am making only a short tour of your country. What do you jackals want, then? As if emboldened by this perhaps too friendly inquiry, the ring of jackals closed in on me. All were panting and open-mouthed. We know, began the eldest, that you have come from the north. That is just what we base our hopes on. You northerners have the kind of intelligence that is not to be found among Arabs. Not a spark of intelligence, let me tell you, can be struck from their cold arrogance. They kill animals for food, and carrion they despise. Not so loud, said I, there are Arabs sleeping nearby. You are indeed a stranger here, said the jackal, or you would know that never in the history of the world has any jackal been afraid of an Arab. Why should we fear them? Is it not misfortune enough for us to be exiled among such creatures? Maybe, said I. Matters so far outside my province I am not competent to judge. It seems to me a very old quarrel. I suppose it's in the blood, and perhaps will only end with it. You were very clever, said the old jackal, and they all began to pant more quickly. The air pumped out of their lungs although they were tiding still. A rank smell which at times I had to set my teeth to endure streamed from their open jaws. You were very clever. What you have just said agrees with our old tradition. So we shall draw blood from them and the quarrel will be over. Oh, said I, more vehemently than I intended. They'll defend themselves. They'll shoot you down in dozens with their muskets. You misunderstand us, said he, a human failing which persists apparently even in the far north. We're not proposing to kill them. All the water in the Nile couldn't cleanse us of that. Why, the mere sight of their living flesh makes us turn tail and flee into cleaner air, into the desert, which for that very reason is our home. And all the jackals around, including many newcomers from farther away, dropped their muzzles between their forelegs and wiped them with their paws. It was as if they were trying to conceal a disgust so overpowering that I felt like leaping over their heads to get away. Then what are you proposing to do? I asked, trying to rise to my feet, but I could not get up. Two young beasts behind me had locked their teeth through my coat and shirt. I had to go on sitting. These are your train-bearers, explained the old jackal, quite seriously, a mark of honor. They must let go, I cried, turning now to the old jackal, now to the youngsters. They will, of course, said the old one, if that is your wish. But it will take a little time, for they have got their teeth well in, as is our custom, and must first loosen their jaws bit by bit. Meanwhile, give ear to our petition. Your conduct hasn't exactly inclined me to grant it, said I. Don't hold it against us that we are clumsy, said he, and now for the first time had recourse to the natural plaintiveness of his voice. We are poor creatures, we have nothing but our teeth. Whatever we want to do, good or bad, we can tackle it only with our teeth. Well, what do you want? I asked, not much mollified. Sir, he cried, and all the jackals howled together. Very remotely it seemed to resemble a melody. Sir, we want you to end this quarrel that divides the world. You are exactly the man whom our ancestors foretold as born to do it. We want to be troubled no more by Arabs, room to breathe, a skyline cleansed of them, no more bleeding of sheep knifed by an Arab. Every beast to die a natural death, no interference till we have drained the carcass empty and picked its bones clean. Cleanliness, nothing but cleanliness is what we want, and now they were all lamenting and sobbing. How can you bear to live in such a world, O noble heart and kindly bowels? Filth is their white, filth is their black, their beards are a horror, the very sight of their eye sockets makes one want to spit, and when they lift an arm, the murk of hell yawns in the armpit. And so, sir, and so, dear sir, by means of your all-powerful hands slit their throats through with these scissors. And in answer to a jerk of his head a jackal came trotting up with a small pair of sewing scissors, covered with ancient rust, dangling from an eye-tooth. Well, here's the scissors at last, and high time to stop, cried the Arab leader of our caravan who had crept upwind toward us and now cracked his great whip. The jackals fled in haste, but at some little distance rallied in a close huddle, all the brutes so tightly packed and rigid that they looked as if penned in a small fold girt by flickering will-o'-the-wisps. So you've been treated to this entertainment too, sir, said the Arab, laughing as gaily as the reserve of his race permitted. You know, then, what the brutes are after? I asked. Of course, said he, it's common knowledge. So long as Arabs exist, that pair of scissors goes wandering through the desert and will wander with us to the end of our days. Every European is offered it for the great work. Every European is just the man that fate has chosen for them. They have the most lunatic hopes, these beasts. They're just fools, utter fools. That's why we like them. They're our dogs. Finer dogs than any of yours. Watch this, now, a camel died last night and I have had it brought here. 4 men came up with the heavy carcass and threw it down before us. It had hardly touched the ground before the jackals lifted up their voices. As if irresistibly drawn by cords each of them began to waver forward, crawling on his belly. They had forgotten the Arabs, forgotten their hatred, the all-obliterating immediate presence of the stinking carrion bewitched them. One was already at the camel's throat, sinking his teeth straight into an artery. Like a vehement small pump endeavoring with as much determination as hopefulness to extinguish some raging fire, every muscle in his body twitched and labored at the task. In a trice they were all on top of the carcass, laboring in common, piled mountain high. And now the caravan leader lashed his cutting whip crisscross over their backs. They lifted their heads, half swooning in ecstasy, saw the Arabs standing before them, felt the sting of the whip on their muzzles, leapt and ran backwards a stretch. But the camel's blood was already lying in pools, reeking to heaven. The carcass was torn wide open in many places. They could not resist it, they were back again. Once more the leader lifted his whip, I stayed his arm. You are right, sir, said he, we'll leave them to their business, besides, it's time to break camp. Well, you've seen them. Marvelous creatures, aren't they? And how they hate us. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The bridge. I was stiff and cold, I was a bridge, I lay over a ravine. My toes on one side, my fingers clutching the other, I had clamped myself fast into the crumbling clay. The tails of my coat fluttered at my sides. Far below brawled the icy trout stream. No tourist strayed to this impassable height, the bridge was not yet traced on any map. So I lay and waited, I could only wait. Without falling, no bridge, once spanned, can cease to be a bridge. It was toward evening one day, was it the first, was it the 1000th? I cannot tell. My thoughts were always in confusion and perpetually moving in a circle. It was toward evening in summer, the roar of the stream had grown deeper, when I heard the sound of a human step. To me. Straighten yourself, bridge, make ready, railless beams, to hold up the passenger entrusted to you. If his steps are uncertain, steady them unobtrusively, but if he stumbles, show what you are made of, and like a mountain god hurl him across to land. He came, he tapped me with the iron point of his stick, then he lifted my coattails with it and put them in order upon me. He plunged the point of his stick into my bushy hair and let it lie there for a long time, forgetting me no doubt while he wildly gazed around him. But then, I was just following him in thought over mountain and valley. He jumped with both feet on the middle of my body. I shuddered with wild pain, not knowing what was happening. Who was it? A child? A dream? A wayfarer? A suicide? A tempter? A destroyer? And I turned around so as to see him. A bridge to turn around. I had not yet turned quite around when I already began to fall. I fell, and in a moment I was torn and transpierced by the sharp rocks which had always gazed up at me so peacefully from the rushing water. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The bucket rider. Coal all spent. The bucket empty. The shovel useless. The stove breathing out cold. The room freezing. The trees outside the window rigid, covered with rime. The sky a silver shield against anyone who looks for help from it. I must have coal. I cannot freeze to death. Behind me is the pitiless stove, before me the pitiless sky, so I must ride out between them and on my journey seek aid from the coal dealer. But he has already grown deaf to ordinary appeals. I must prove irrefutably to him that I have not a single grain of coal left, and that he means to me the very sun in the firmament. I must approach like a beggar, who, with the death rattle already in his throat, insists on dying on the doorstep, and to whom the cook accordingly decides to give the dregs of the coffee pot. Just so must the coal dealer, filled with rage, but acknowledging the command, "Thou shalt not kill," fling a shovelful of coal into my bucket. My mode of arrival must decide the matter, so I ride off on the bucket. Seated on the bucket, my hands on the handle, the simplest kind of bridle, I propel myself with difficulty down the stairs. But once downstairs my bucket ascends, superbly, superbly. Camels humbly squatting on the ground do not rise with more dignity, shaking themselves under the sticks of their drivers. Through the hard frozen streets we go at a regular canter. Often I am upraised as high as the first story of a house. Never do I sink as low as the house doors. And at last I float at an extraordinary height above the vaulted cellar of the dealer, whom I see far below crouching over his table, where he is writing. He has opened the door to let out the excessive heat. Coal dealer. I cry in a voice burned hollow by the frost and muffled in the cloud made by my breath. Please, coal dealer, give me a little coal. My bucket is so light that I can ride on it. Be kind. When I can I'll pay you. The dealer puts his hand to his ear. Do I hear right? He throws the question over his shoulder to his wife. Do I hear right? A customer. I hear nothing, says his wife, breathing in and out peacefully while she knits on, her back pleasantly warmed by the heat. Oh yes, you must hear, I cry. It's me, an old customer, faithful and true, only without means at the moment. Wife, says the dealer, it's someone, it must be. My ears can't have deceived me so much as that. It must be a very old customer, that can move me so deeply. What ails you, man? Says his wife, ceasing from her work for a moment and pressing her knitting to her bosom. It's nobody, the street is empty, all our customers are provided for. We could close down the shop for several days and take a rest. But I'm sitting up here on the bucket, I cry, and numb, frozen tears dim my eyes. Please look up here, just once, you'll see me directly. I beg you, just a shovelful, and if you give me more it'll make me so happy that I won't know what to do. All the other customers are provided for. Oh, if I could only hear the coal clattering into the bucket. I'm coming, says the coal dealer, and on his short legs he makes to climb the steps of the cellar. But his wife is already beside him, holds him back by the arm and says, You stay here. Seeing you persist in your fancies I'll go myself. Think of the bad fit of coughing you had during the night. But for a piece of business, even if it's one you've only fancied in your head, you're prepared to forget your wife and child and sacrifice your lungs. I'll go. Then be sure to tell him all the kinds of coal we have in stock. I'll shout out the prices after you. Right, says his wife, climbing up to the street. Naturally she sees me at once. Frau Coal Dealer, I cry, my humblest greetings. Just one shovelful of coal, here in my bucket. I'll carry it home myself. One shovelful of the worst you have. I'll pay you in full for it, of course, but not just now, not just now. What a knell-like sound the words, not just now, have, and how bewilderingly they mingle with the evening chimes that fall from the church steeple nearby. Well, what does he want? Shouts the dealer. Nothing, his wife shouts back, there's nothing here, I see nothing, I hear nothing, only 6 striking, and now we must shut up the shop. The cold is terrible, tomorrow we'll likely have lots to do again. She sees nothing and hears nothing, but all the same she loosens her apron strings and waves her apron to waft me away. She succeeds, unluckily. My bucket has all the virtues of a good steed except powers of resistance, which it has not. It is too light. A woman's apron can make it fly through the air. You bad woman, I shout back, while she, turning into the shop, half contemptuous, half reassured, flourishes her fist in the air. You bad woman, I begged you for a shovelful of the worst coal and you would not give it me. And with that I ascend into the regions of the ice mountains and am lost forever. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The new advocate. We have a new advocate, Dr. Bucephalus. There is little in his appearance to remind you that he was once Alexander of Macedon's battle charger. Of course, if you know his story, you are aware of something. But even a simple usher whom I saw the other day on the front steps of the law courts, a man with the professional appraisal of the regular small bettor at a racecourse, was running an admiring eye over the advocate as he mounted the marble steps with a high action that made them ring beneath his feet. In general, the bar approves the admission of Bucephalus. With astonishing insight, people tell themselves that, modern society being what it is, Bucephalus is in a difficult position, and therefore, considering also his importance in the history of the world, he deserves at least a friendly reception. Nowadays, it cannot be denied, there is no Alexander the Great. There are plenty of men who know how to murder people. The skill needed to reach over a banqueting table and pink a friend with a lance is not lacking. And for many, Macedonia is too confining, so that they curse Philip, the father. But no one at all, can blaze a trail to India. Even in his day the gates of India were beyond reach, yet the king's sword pointed the way to them. Today the gates have receded to remoter and loftier places. No one points the way. Many carry swords, but only to brandish them, and the eye that tries to follow them is confused. So perhaps it is really best to do as Bucephalus has done and absorb oneself in law books. In the quiet lamplight, his flanks unhampered by the thighs of a rider, free and far from the clamor of battle, he reads and turns the pages of our ancient tomes. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. An old manuscript. It looks as if much had been neglected in our country's system of defense. We have not concerned ourselves with it until now and have gone about our daily work, but things that have been happening recently begin to trouble us. I have a cobbler's workshop in the square that lies before the emperor's palace. Scarcely have I taken my shutters down, at the first glimmer of dawn, when I see armed soldiers already posted in the mouth of every street opening on the square. But these soldiers are not ours, they are obviously nomads from the north. In some way that is incomprehensible to me, they have pushed right into the capital, although it is a long way from the frontier. At any rate, here they are. It seems that every morning there are more of them. As is their nature, they camp under the open sky, for they abominate dwelling houses. They busy themselves sharpening swords, whittling arrows, and practicing horsemanship. This peaceful square, which was always kept so scrupulously clean, they have made literally into a stable. We do try every now and then to run out of our shops and clear away at least the worst of the filth, but this happens less and less often, for the labor is in vain and brings us besides into danger of falling under the hoofs of the wild horses or of being crippled with lashes from the whips. Speech with the nomads is impossible. They do not know our language, indeed they hardly have a language of their own. They communicate with each other much as jackdaws do. A screeching as of jackdaws is always in our ears. Our way of living and our institutions they neither understand nor care to understand. And so they are unwilling to make sense even out of our sign language. You can gesture at them till you dislocate your jaws and your wrists and still they will not have understood you and will never understand. They often make grimaces. Then the whites of their eyes turn up and foam gathers on their lips, but they do not mean anything by that, not even a threat. They do it because it is their nature to do it. Whatever they need, they take. You cannot call it taking by force. They grab at something and you simply stand aside and leave them to it. From my stock, too, they have taken many good articles. But I cannot complain when I see how the butcher, for instance, suffers across the street. As soon as he brings in any meat the nomads snatch it all from him and gobble it up. Even their horses devour flesh. Often enough a horseman and his horse are lying side by side, both of them gnawing at the same joint, one at either end. The butcher is nervous and does not dare to stop his deliveries of meat. We understand that, however, and subscribe money to keep him going. If the nomads got no meat, who knows what they might think of doing? Who knows anyhow what they may think of, even though they get meat every day? Not long ago the butcher thought he might at least spare himself the trouble of slaughtering, and so one morning he brought along a live ox. But he will never dare to do that again. I lay for a whole hour flat on the floor at the back of my workshop with my head muffled in all the clothes and rugs and pillows I had simply to keep from hearing the bellowing of that ox, which the nomads were leaping on from all sides, tearing morsels out of its living flesh with their teeth. It had been quiet for a long time before I risked coming out. They were lying overcome around the remains of the carcass like drunkards around a wine cask. This was the occasion when I fancied I actually saw the emperor himself at a window of the palace. Usually he never enters these outer rooms but spends all his time in the innermost garden. Yet on this occasion he was standing, or so at least it seemed to me, at one of the windows, watching with bent head the goings-on before his residence. What is going to happen? We all ask ourselves. How long can we endure this burden and torment? The emperor's palace has drawn the nomads here but does not know how to drive them away again. The gate stays shut. The guards, who used to be always marching out and in with ceremony, keep close behind barred windows. It is left to us artisans and tradesmen to save our country, but we are not equal to such a task, nor have we ever claimed to be capable of it. This is a misunderstanding of some kind, and it will be the ruin of us. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The knock at the manor gate. It was summer, a hot day. With my sister I was passing the gate of a great house on our way home. I cannot tell now whether she knocked on the gate out of mischief or out of absence of mind, or merely threatened it with her fist and did not knock at all. 100 paces further on along the road, which here turned to the left, began the village. We did not know it very well, but no sooner had we passed the first house when people appeared and made friendly or warning signs to us. They were themselves apparently terrified, bowed down with terror. They pointed toward the manor house that we had passed and reminded us of the knock on the gate. The proprietor of the manor would charge us with it. The interrogation would begin immediately. I remained quite calm and also tried to calm my sister's fears. Probably she had not struck the door at all, and if she had, nowhere in the world would that be a reason for prosecution. I tried to make this clear to the people around us. They listened to me but refrained from passing any opinion. Later they told me that not only my sister, but I too, as her brother, would be charged. I nodded and smiled. We all gazed back at the manor, as one watches a distant smoke cloud and waits for the flames to appear. And right enough we presently saw horsemen riding in through the wide open gate. Dust rose, concealing everything, only the tops of the tall spears glittered. And hardly had the troop vanished into the manor courtyard before they seemed to have turned their horses again, for they were already on their way to us. I urged my sister to leave me. I myself would set everything right. She refused to leave me. I told her that she should at least change, so as to appear in better clothes before these gentlemen. At last she obeyed and set out on the long road to our home. Already the horsemen were beside us, and even before dismounting they inquired after my sister. She wasn't here at the moment, was the apprehensive reply, but she would come later. The answer was received almost with indifference. The important thing seemed their having found me. The chief members of the party appeared to be a young lively fellow, who was a judge, and his silent assistant, who was called Asman. I was asked to enter the farmhouse. Shaking my head and hitching up my trousers, I slowly began to move, while the sharp eyes of the party scrutinized me. I still half believed that a word would be enough to free me, a city man, and with honor too, from this peasant folk. But when I had stepped over the threshold of the parlor, the judge, who had hastened in front and was already awaiting me, said, "I'm really sorry for this man." And it was beyond all possibility of doubt that by this he did not mean my present state, but something that was to happen to me. The room looked more like a prison cell than the parlor of the farmhouse. Great stone flags on the floor, dark, quite bare walls, into one of which an iron ring was fixed, in the middle something that looked half a pallet, half an operating table. Could I still endure any other air than prison air? That is the great question, or rather it would be if I still had any prospect of release. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. 11 sons. I have 11 sons. The first is outwardly very plain, but serious and clever, yet, although I love him as I love all my children, I do not rate him very highly. His mental processes seem to me to be too simple. He looks neither to right nor to left, nor into the far distance. He runs around all the time, or rather revolves, within his own little circle of thoughts. The second is handsome, slim, well-made. One draws one's breath with delight to watch him with a fencing foil. He is clever too, but has experience of the world as well. He has seen much, and therefore even our native country seems to yield more secrets to him than to the stay-at-home. Yet I am sure that this advantage is not only and not even essentially due to his travels, it is rather an attribute of his own inimitable nature, which is acknowledged for instance by everyone who has ever tried to copy him in, let us say, the fancy high dive he does into the water, somersaulting several times over, yet with almost violent self-control. To the very end of the springboard the emulator keeps up his courage and his desire to follow, but at that point, instead of leaping into the air, he sits down suddenly and lifts his arms in excuse. And despite all this, I ought really to feel blessed with such a son. My attachment to him is not untroubled. His left eye is a little smaller than his right and blinks a good deal. Only a small fault, certainly, and one which even lends more audacity to his face than it would otherwise have, nor, considering his unapproachable self-sufficiency, would anyone think of noticing and finding fault with this smaller eye and the way it blinks. Yet I, his father, do so. Of course, it is not the physical blemish that worries me, but a small irregularity of the spirit that somehow corresponds to it, a kind of stray poison in the blood, a kind of inability to develop to the full the potentialities of his nature which I alone can see. On the other hand, this is just what makes him again my own true son, for this fault of his is a fault of our whole family and in him it is only too apparent. My third son is handsome too, but not in a way that I appreciate. He has the good looks of a singer, the curving lips, the dreaming eye, the kind of head that asks for drapery behind it to make it effective, the too deeply arched chest, hands that are quick to fly up and much too quick to fall limp, legs that move delicately because they cannot support a weight. And besides, the tone of his voice is not round and full, it takes you in for a moment, the connoisseur pricks up his ears, but almost at once its breath gives out. Although, in general, everything tempts me to bring this son of mine into the limelight, I prefer to keep him in the background. He himself is not insistent, yet not because he is aware of his shortcomings but out of innocence. Moreover, he does not feel at home in our age, as if he admitted belonging to our family, yet knew that he belonged also to another which he has lost forever. He is often melancholy and nothing can cheer him. My fourth son is perhaps the most companionable of all. A true child of his age, he is understood by everyone, he stands on what is common ground to all men, and everyone feels inclined to give him a nod. Perhaps this universal appreciation is what makes his nature rather facile, his movements rather free, his judgments rather unconcerned. Many of his remarks are worth quoting over and over again, but by no means all of them, for by and large his extreme facility becomes irritating. He is like a man who makes a wonderful takeoff from the ground, cleaves the air like a swallow, and after all comes down helplessly in a desert waste, a nothing. Such reflections gall me when I look at him. My fifth son is kind and good, promised less than he performed, used to be so insignificant that one literally felt alone in his presence, but has achieved a certain reputation. If I were asked how this came about, I could hardly tell you. Perhaps innocence makes its way easiest through the elemental chaos of this world, and innocent he certainly is. Perhaps too innocent, friendly to everyone, perhaps too friendly. I confess, I don't feel comfortable when I hear him praised. It seems to make praise rather too cheap to bestow it on anyone so obviously praiseworthy as this son of mine. My sixth son seems, at first glance anyhow, the most thoughtful of all. He is given to hanging his head, and yet he is a great talker. So he is not easy to get at. If he is on the downgrade, he falls into impenetrable melancholy. If he is in the ascendant, he maintains his advantage by sheer talk. Yet I grant him a certain self-forgetful passionate absorption. In the full light of day he often fights his way through a tangle of thoughts as if in a dream. Without being ill, his health on the contrary is very good. He sometimes staggers, especially in the twilight, but he needs no help, he never falls. Perhaps his physical growth is the cause of this phenomenon, he is much too tall for his age. That makes him look ugly in general, although he has remarkable beauty in detail, in hands and feet, for instance. His forehead, too, is ugly, both its skin and its bone formation are somehow arrested in their development. The seventh son belongs to me perhaps more than all the others. The world would not know how to appreciate him, it does not understand his peculiar brand of wit. I do not overvalue him. I know he is of little enough importance. If the world had no other fault than that of not appreciating him, it would still be blameless. But within the family circle I should not care to be without this son of mine. He contributes a certain restlessness as well as a reverence for tradition, and combines them both, at least that is how I feel it, into an incontestable whole. True, he knows less than anyone what to do with this achievement. The wheel of the future will never be started rolling by him. But his disposition is so stimulating, so rich in hope. I wish that he had children and children's children. Unfortunately, he does not seem inclined to fulfill my wish. With a self-satisfaction that I understand as much as I deplore, and which stands in magnificent contrast to the verdict of the world, he goes everywhere alone, pays no attention to girls, and yet will never lose his good humor. My eighth son is my child of sorrow, and I do not really know why. He keeps me at a distance, and yet I feel a close paternal tie binding me to him. Time has done much to lessen the pain, but once I used often to tremble at the mere thought of him. He goes his own way. He has broken off all communication with me, and certainly with his hard head, his small athletic body. Only his legs were rather frail when he was a boy, but perhaps that has meanwhile righted itself. He will make a success of anything he chooses. Many a time I used to want to call him back, to ask him how things really were with him, why he cut himself off so completely from his father, and what his fundamental purpose was in life, but now he is so far away and so much time has passed that things had better stay as they are. I hear that he is the only one of my sons to grow a full beard. That cannot look well, of course, on a man so small as he is. My ninth son is very elegant and has what women consider a definitely melting eye. So melting that there are occasions when he can cajole even me, although I know that a wet sponge is literally enough to wipe away all that unearthly brilliance. But the curious thing about the boy is that he makes no attempt to be seductive. He would be content to spend his life lying on the sofa and wasting his glances on the ceiling, or still better, keeping them to himself under his eyelids. When he is lying in this favorite position, he enjoys talking and talks quite well, concisely and pithily, but still only within narrow limits. Once he oversteps these, which he cannot avoid doing since they are so narrow, what he says is quite empty. One would sign him to stop, if one had any hope that such slumberous eyes were even aware of the gesture. My 10th son is supposed to be an insincere character. I shall not entirely deny or confirm this supposition. Certainly anyone who sees him approaching with the pomposity of a man twice his age, in a frock coat always tightly buttoned, an old but meticulously brushed black hat, with an expressionless face, slightly jutting chin, protruding eyelids that mask the light behind them, 2 fingers very often at his lips. Anyone seeing him thus is bound to think, what an utter hypocrite. But then, just listen to him talking. With understanding, thoughtfully, brusquely, cutting across questions with satirical vivacity, in complete accord with the universe, an accord that is surprising, natural and gay, an accord that of necessity straightens the neck and makes the body proud. Many who think themselves very clever and for this reason, as they fancied, felt a dislike for his outward appearance, have become strongly attached to him because of his conversation. There are other people, again, who are unaffected by his appearance but who find his conversation hypocritical. I, being his father, will not pronounce a verdict, but I must admit that the latter critics are at least to be taken more seriously than the former. My 11th son is delicate, probably the frailest of my sons, but deceptive in his weakness, for at times he can be strong and resolute, though even then there is somehow always an underlying weakness. Yet it is not a weakness to be ashamed of, merely something that appears as weakness only on this solid earth of ours. For instance, is not a readiness for flight a kind of weakness too, since it consists in a wavering, an unsteadiness, a fluttering? Something of that nature characterizes my son. These are not, of course, the characteristics to rejoice a father, they tend obviously to destroy a family. Sometimes he looks at me as if he would say, "I shall take you with me, father." Then I think, "You are the last person I would trust myself to." And again his look seems to say, "Then let me be at least the last." These are my 11 sons. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. My neighbor. My business rests entirely on my own shoulders. 2 girl clerks with typewriters and ledgers in the anteroom, my own room with writing desk, safe, consulting table, easy chair, and telephone. Such is my entire working apparatus. So simple to control, so easy to direct. I'm quite young, and lots of business comes my way. I don't complain, I don't complain. At the beginning of the year a young man snapped up the empty premises next to mine, which very foolishly I had hesitated to rent until it was too late. They also consist of a room and an anteroom, with a kitchen, however, thrown in. The room and anteroom I would certainly have found some use for, my 2 girl clerks feel somewhat overdriven as it is, but what use would a kitchen have been to me? This petty consideration was solely responsible for my allowing the premises to be snatched from under my nose. Now that young man sits there. Harris, his name is. What he actually does there I have no idea. On the door is a sign, Harris Bureau. I have made inquiries and I am told it is a business similar to mine. One can't exactly warn people against extending the fellow credit, for after all he is a young and pushing man who probably has a future. Yet one can't go so far as to advise it, for by all appearances he has no assets yet. The usual thing said by people who don't know. Sometimes I meet Harris on the stairs. He seems always to be in an extraordinary hurry, for he literally shoots past me. I have never got a good look at him yet, for his office key is always in his hand when he passes me. In a trice he has the door open. Like the tail of a rat he has slipped through and I'm left standing again before the sign, Harris Bureau, which I have read already far oftener than it deserves. The wretchedly thin walls betray the honorable and capable man, but shield the dishonest. My telephone is fixed to the wall that separates me from my neighbor. But I singled it out merely as a particularly ironical circumstance. For even if it hung on the opposite wall, everything could be heard in the next room. I have accustomed myself to refrain from naming the names of my customers when speaking on the telephone to them. But of course it does not need much skill to guess the names from characteristic but unavoidable turns of the conversation. Sometimes I absolutely dance with apprehension around the telephone, the receiver at my ear, and yet can't help divulging secrets. Because of all this my business decisions have naturally become unsure, my voice nervous. What is Harris doing while I am telephoning? If I wanted to exaggerate, and one must often do that so as to make things clear in one's mind, I might assert that Harris does not require a telephone, he uses mine, he pushes his sofa against the wall and listens. While I at the other side must fly to the telephone, listen to all the requests of my customers, come to difficult and grave decisions, carry out long calculations, but worst of all, during all this time, involuntarily give Harris valuable information through the wall. Perhaps he doesn't wait even for the end of the conversation, but gets up at the point where the matter has become clear to him, flies through the town with his usual haste, and, before I have hung up the receiver, is already at his goal working against me. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. A crossbreed. A sport. I have a curious animal, half kitten, half lamb. It is a legacy from my father. But it only developed in my time. Formerly it was far more lamb than kitten. Now it is both in about equal parts. From the cat it takes its head and claws, from the lamb its size and shape. From both its eyes, which are wild and flickering, its hair, which is soft, lying close to its body, its movements, which partake both of skipping and slinking. Lying on the window sill in the sun it curls up in a ball and purrs. Out in the meadow it rushes about like mad and is scarcely to be caught. It flees from cats and makes to attack lambs. On moonlight nights its favorite promenade is along the eaves. It cannot mew and it loathes rats. Beside the hen co-op it can lie for hours in ambush, but it has never yet seized an opportunity for murder. I feed it on milk, that seems to suit it best. In long draughts it sucks the milk in through its fang-like teeth. Naturally it is a great source of entertainment for children. Sunday morning is the visiting hour. I sit with the little beast on my knees, and the children of the whole neighborhood stand around me. Then the strangest questions are asked, which no human being could answer. Why there is only one such animal, why rather than anybody else should own it, whether there was ever an animal like it before and what would happen if it died, whether it feels lonely, why it has no children, what it is called, etc. I never trouble to answer, but confine myself without further explanation to exhibiting a possession. Sometimes the children bring cats with them, once they actually brought 2 lambs. But against all their hopes there was no scene of recognition. The animals gazed calmly at each other with their animal eyes, and obviously accepted their reciprocal existence as a divine fact. Sitting on my knees, the beast knows neither fear nor lust of pursuit. Pressed against me, it is happiest. It remains faithful to the family that brought it up. In that there is certainly no extraordinary mark of fidelity, but merely the true instinct of an animal which, though it has countless step relations in the world, has perhaps not a single blood relation, and to which consequently the protection it has found with us is sacred. Sometimes I cannot help laughing when it sniffs around me and winds itself between my legs and simply will not be parted from me. Not content with being lamb and cat, it almost insists on being a dog as well. Once when, as may happen to anyone, I could see no way out of my business problems and all that they involved, and was ready to let everything go, and in this mood was lying in my rocking chair in my room, the beast on my knees, I happened to glance down and saw tears dropping from its huge whiskers. Were they mine, or were they the animal's? Had this cat, along with the soul of a lamb, the ambitions of a human being? I did not inherit much from my father, but this legacy is quite remarkable. It has the restlessness of both beasts, that of the cat and that of the lamb, diverse as they are. For that reason its skin feels too tight for it. Sometimes it jumps up on the armchair beside me, plants its front legs on my shoulder, and put its muzzle to my ear. It is as if it were saying something to me, and as a matter of fact it turns its head afterwards and gazes in my face to see the impression its communication has made. And to oblige it I behave as if I had understood, and nod. Then it jumps to the floor and dances about with joy. Perhaps the knife of the butcher would be a release for this animal, but as it is a legacy I must deny it that. So it must wait until the breath voluntarily leaves its body, even though it sometimes gazes at me with a look of human understanding, challenging me to do the thing of which both of us are thinking. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The Cares of a Family Man. Some say the word Odratic is of Slavonic origin, and try to account for it on that basis. Others again believe it to be of German origin, only influenced by Slavonic. The uncertainty of both interpretations allows one to assume with justice that neither is accurate, especially as neither of them provides an intelligent meaning of the word. No one, of course, would occupy himself with such studies if there were not a creature called Odratic. At first glance it looks like a flat star-shaped spool for thread, and indeed it does seem to have thread wound upon it. To be sure, they are only old, broken-off bits of thread, knotted and tangled together, of the most varied sorts and colors. But it is not only a spool, for a small wooden crossbar sticks out of the middle of the star, and another small rod is joined to that at a right angle. By means of this latter rod on one side and one of the points of the star on the other, the whole thing can stand upright as if on two legs. One is tempted to believe that the creature once had some sort of intelligible shape and is now only a broken-down remnant. Yet this does not seem to be the case. At least there is no sign of it. Nowhere is there an unfinished or unbroken surface to suggest anything of the kind. The whole thing looks senseless enough, but in its own way perfectly finished. In any case, closer scrutiny is impossible, since Odratic is extraordinarily nimble and can never be laid hold of. He lurks by turns in the garret, the stairway, the lobbies, the entrance hall. Often for months on end he is not to be seen, then he has presumably moved into other houses, but he always comes faithfully back to our house again. Many a time when you go out of the door and he happens just to be leaning directly beneath you against the banisters you feel inclined to speak to him. Of course, you put no difficult questions to him, you treat him. He is so diminutive that you cannot help it, rather like a child. Well, what's your name? You ask him. Odratic, he says. And where do you live? No fixed abode, he says and laughs, but it is only the kind of laughter that has no lungs behind it. It sounds rather like the rustling of fallen leaves. And that is usually the end of the conversation. Even these answers are not always forthcoming. Often he stays mute for a long time, as wooden as his appearance. I ask myself, to no purpose, what is likely to happen to him? Can he possibly die? Anything that dies has had some kind of aim in life, S6 me kind of activity, which has worn out, but that does not apply to Odratic. Am I to suppose, then, that he will always be rolling down the stairs, with ends of thread trailing after him, right before the feet of my children, and my children's children? He does no harm to anyone that one can see, but the idea that he is likely to survive me I find almost painful. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. A common contusion. A common experience, resulting in a common confusion. A has to transact important business with B and H. He goes to H for a preliminary interview, accomplishes the journey there in 10 minutes, and the journey back in the same time, and on returning boasts to his family of his expedition. Next day he goes again to H, this time to sell his business finally. As that by all appearances will require several hours, it leaves very early in the morning. But although all the surrounding circumstances, at least in his estimation, are exactly the same as the day before, this time it takes him 10 hours to reach H. When he arrives there quite exhausted in the evening he is informed that B, annoyed at his absence, had left half an hour before to go to his village, and that they must have passed each other on the road. A is advised to wait. But in his anxiety about his business he sets off at once and hurries home. This time he covers the distance, without paying any particular attention to the fact, practically in an instant. At home he learns that B had arrived quite early, immediately after his departure, indeed that he had met A on the threshold and reminded him of his business. but he had replied that he had no time to spare, he must go at once. In spite of this incomprehensible behavior of A, however, B had stayed on to wait for his return. It is true, he had asked several times whether A was not back yet, but he was still sitting up in his room. Overjoyed at the opportunity of seeing B at once and explaining everything to him, A rushes upstairs. He is almost at the top, when he stumbles, twists a sinew, and almost fainting with the pain, incapable even of uttering a cry, only able to moan faintly in the darkness, he hears B, impossible to tell whether at a great distance or quite near him, stamping down the stairs in a violent rage and vanishing for good. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The truth about Sancho Panza. Without making any boast of it, Sancho Panza succeeded in the course of years, by feeding him a great number of romances of chivalry and adventure in the evening and night hours, in so diverting from himself his demon, whom he later called Don Quixote, that this demon thereupon set out, uninhibited, on the maddest exploits, which, however, for the lack of a preordained object, which should have been Sancho Panza himself, harmed nobody. A free man, Sancho Panza philosophically followed Don Quixote on his crusades, perhaps out of a sense of responsibility, and had of them a great and edifying entertainment to the end of his days. Translated by Willa and Edwin Muir. The silence of the sirens. Proof that inadequate, even childish measures may serve to rescue one from peril. To protect himself from the sirens, Ulysses stopped his ears with wax and had himself bound to the mast of his ship. Naturally, any and every traveler before him could have done the same, except those whom the sirens allured even from a great distance, but it was known to all the world that such things were of no help whatever. The song of the sirens could pierce through everything, and the longing of those they seduced would have broken far stronger bonds than chains and masts. But Ulysses did not think of that, although he had probably heard of it. He trusted absolutely to his handful of wax and his fathom of chain, and in innocent elation over his little stratagem sailed out to meet the sirens. Now the sirens have a still more fatal weapon than their song, namely their silence. And though admittedly such a thing has never happened, still it is conceivable that someone might possibly have escaped from their singing, but from their silence certainly never. Against the feeling of having